When we think of documentaries, we think about truth. In reality, documentaries are more similar to works of fiction that we'd imagine. They are based on reality, but they make use of fictional story arcs, framing techniques, omissions, tropes. They are further manipulated by the filmmakers that decide which subjects to include, where to place the camera and how to use the camera, which scenes to use and how to cut them in post-production, an ensemble of cinematic choices that inevitably represent the filmmaker's version of the truth. At best, a documentary gives us the tools to understand the reality around us and allow the audience to discover their own truth. At worst, and in most recent cases, the opposite happens. But because of the assumed meaning of documentary and its correlation with truth in pop culture, these films have seen a huge comeback in later years, becoming mainstream, and they do have a huge impact in how we see the world around us and the people that are in it. Just consider that the 2005 docuseries Making a Murderer persuaded so many viewers to petition for the release of its subjects that President Obama felt compelled to respond. The Shane Dawson's 8-part series about Jake Paul on YouTube has successfully turned the perception of many viewers on him. We have become primed to believe documentaries in any form and on any platform. So today I want to shed some light on why we shouldn't. Professor and filmmaker Rick Prelinger wrote a very controversial post on Facebook saying that documentary filmmakers are allowed such a great authority by the audience, so much so that they're not obliged to cite their sources, and therefore are a privileged form of fiction. He also highlights that if he were to write an academic paper or peer-reviewed article using the same lack of proof, he would be toast, and he's right. Compared to journal articles that maybe start out with some hypothesis, but whose central argument is about discovering the sound truth of a certain topic, most documentaries start off already with a solution or an objective and work retroactively to sell you that idea. For example, in Leaving Neverland, the self-confessed goal of the director was to give a forum to the alleged victims of Michael Jackson alone, hereby excluding any other proof to the contrary, or any type of testimony that may antagonize that view. Shane Dawson on YouTube, although not as explicitly, does the same thing. The final objective of most of his docuseries have been about humanizing and changing the negative perceptions of certain subjects.
I have a weird gut feeling about you. I always have. I think you're better than all of this drama shit.
With that concept in mind, everything that is shown to us is already highly biased, and certain facts are even warped towards that goal. For example, in the credits of Leaving Neverland, one of the allegedly abused individuals is shown burning Jackson memorabilia that was gifted to him by Michael Jackson himself. Yet, Julian's auctions confirmed that Wade Robson sold those same items in 2011. So I don't know what they've burned, but probably replicas. However, since the documentary previously connected the gifts given to these people by Jackson as a grooming technique employed by the pop star, which is in itself a correct association, the final scene of them burning said items amplifies those emotions, producing a sense of catharsis and liberation in the audience. Masqueraded by the vestige of the pop cultural ideal of what a documentary is, these films or series are allowed margins of known truth which the audience rarely picks upon. Of course, I want to specify that although many of these documentaries may use these techniques, that doesn't mean that what they tell you isn't true. The end may justify the means, sort of thing. But as audiences, we should finally learn the methods that are being used in order to avoid passively accepting any sort of claim or emotionally driven reaction that they're supposed to elicit out of us. Documentary directors often frame their story in a way over another. This is particularly true when we're talking about documentaries focusing on people. For example, throughout Making a Murderer series, Avery is portrayed as almost lovable, innocuous, someone whose demeanor clearly doesn't fit the striped prison gear that has been given to him, and by extension, the label of murderer. Yet, the filmmakers purposely forgot to include other facts about his character. For example, that he burnt a cat to death. Now, obviously, this doesn't make him guilty of the crime, but it would have casted some shadows on his character, which the series obviously doesn't want to raise. Everything can be framed, and it's a common tactic used mostly in advertising, political communication, and journalism. Framing theory suggests that the way in which information is presented, or the perspective adopted by the message or story, influences the responses that people will have on that specific topic. Taxes can be framed as a social burden or a social virtue. Clothes can be framed as old or vintage. Basically, as Entman argues, to frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation. Michael Jackson's persona gives us an excellent example of this. During his life, himself and those around him carefully constructed a mythology about him that was about a grown man being a boy at heart, robbed of his own childhood, whose eccentricities are a result of loneliness, abuse, and taking on responsibilities way too young. How cruel can you be not seeing that he surrounds himself with children because he's an innocent Peter Pan-like figure?
But Michael, you're a 44-year-old man now. What do you get out of this? What do you get out of this?
He's 4.
Yeah, I'm 4. I've said it many times. My greatest inspiration comes from kids. Every song I write, every dance I do, all the poetry I write is all inspired from that level of innocence, that consciousness of purity. And children have that. I see God in the face of children. And I just love being around that all the time.
The opposing frame that Leaving Neverland suggests as well is the concept that his childlike behavior is a manipulation to adults and kids alike, used to bait these children, and that his eccentricities clearly suggest something off about him.
Nobody can befriend him. He has to befriend people. He's unapproachable. So for him to want to be our friend was, oh my God, how lucky are we?
The frame here is, he was such a skilled manipulator and predator that his fame and charisma allowed him to get away with it. I would argue that Shane Dawson has also worked really hard to change the framing about himself in later years. If you remember old school Shane, his personality was mostly controversial, humorous, even abrasive. Nowadays, instead, Shane Dawson spells as caring, kind, and empath even, and whose main drive is about helping out others, so much so that he's been compared to Ellen DeGeneres and Oprah Winfrey.
But I also feel like I get them and I want to help them and all of that.
Because you're empathic.
So an empath. I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Shane Dawson skillfully framed himself in a different way, specifically in his latest documentaries, in such a way that perhaps he's the hidden actual main character of all of his docuseries. By helping Grave Girl, by appearing incredibly humble and surprised by Jeffree Star's money, as if it doesn't have any.
This is there's a mountain!
Oh my God, you think it's zebras?
Zebras? He's rich. It's like El Chorito. What's that? El Chorito? Yeah, like a big fancy Mexican restaurant. I am poor.
Alongside framing, other manipulatory techniques include revealing information out of chronological order for narrative convenience, using sound bites out of context, desaturating color footage to make it look older, using archival material to portray something other than what is originally represented, using external figures that reacts to what is being discussed. This way the audience receive not only the information, but also a diegetic crowd's reaction to it, gasps, laughter, and so forth, by effectively effectively becoming extensions of these people and identify and align ourselves with their spontaneous responses to a given character or discovery. Developing character arcs by pacing the words and actions of subjects over time to create individual trajectories that enhance the final objective of the story. Using family or childhood footage to create a more personal narrative that triggers our long-term memory and feeling of loss connected to a more idyllic past, making the present far more dramatic. Sensationalize unsubstantiated emotional claims to provide a sense of factual correspondence.
My name from him, little one. It came with a song that he would sing to me, like this kind of lullaby. Has anyone seen my little one?
And playing on the audience assumptions, stereotypes, and commonly held beliefs to strengthen the logic represented in the story. A very common assumption used in many documentaries is that of the so-called cycle of abuse, meaning the commonly held belief that abused victims are more likely to either become abusers themselves or that somehow their present negative behavior is a direct consequence of said abuse. The previous framing of Michael Jackson has played on this assumption for a very long time. The idea that Jackson's childhood or lack thereof is a consequence or explanation of his current odd behavior. The same pop psychology has been used in the latest documentary about R. Kelly, which includes a piece of an interview that he made in the past with the musician saying that he was molested at age 7 and therefore whatever you're taught as a child stays with you. It's very easy to use this concept of the cycle of abuse as an excuse. Shane Dawson uses it all the time in justifying Jack's Paul behavior.
The truth of it is like everything you are, all of it, is really rooted in how you were raised and your childhood. Like, it's so obvious to me, some of these things. Like, you had no control when you were a kid. Your dad doesn't really have a line. He's like offensive and whatever. It's like, it does all kind of make sense when you look at it that way.
However, science has been discussing this theory since the 1940s and still needs to find conclusive proof. Mostly, the biggest problem in assessing this theory is that of causality. It's incredibly hard to tell whether childhood abuse is the actual or sole cause of later crimes or odd behavior. It could be the synergy of a series of common factors. However, recent studies give statistics which seem to not give any credence to the theory of the cycle of abuse. We should really start considering the fact that these assumptions are only excuses that we have adopted en masse to give some sort of reason or predictability to cruelty, when in fact it doesn't have any, and that's scarier. But scariest is the concept of being easily manipulated on the same fake assumptions by anyone who puts them in a series or film or YouTube video. To conclude, the notion of truthfulness and objectivity, long associated with documentaries, is a myth. Filmmakers make conscious choices and use a series of tactics, sometimes even warping facts, to lead the audience towards the conclusion that they want you to make. Documentaries and those who produce them don't have to respond to any sort of additional ethics that fiction filmmakers already adhere to. And at the end of the day, mainstream documentaries aim at getting mostly one thing only: viewership, which translates into money. Netflix is making huge numbers, although we actually don't know them because they don't make them publicly available, on docuseries like The Circus, Making a Murderer, The Jinx. Living Neverland is the most viewed documentary ever produced by HBO, and Shane Dawson's pulls figures always in the millions for each of his doc installments. Framing cannot be avoided. There is always going to be a point of view which is always going to be biased. But that doesn't mean that we need to accept everything that we hear or see in a documentary as the ultimate truth. Just being aware that framing does exist gives us an advantage in understanding that what we're seeing could have been profoundly impacted by the way the communicator on the other side decided to present it to us. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more video essays and media analysis about TV series, movies, and pop culture, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell button to be notified about my next video. I'll see you next time. Bye.